From children who did not know any better to teenagers who found themselves with the wrong group of people, these are some of the most heartbreaking sentences for kids of all time. Khalif Browder. A lot of things went wrong in Khalif Browder's case. In 2010, the African-American youth was stopped in the Bronx neighborhood during what he believed was a routine stop and frisk. However, what he did not know was that a man named Roberto Bautista had identified Khalif and a friend of his from the back of a squad car as the two thieves who stole his backpack containing valuables just a few days prior. When the police stopped Khalif and his friend, they both denied involvement in the crime and did not have any of Roberto's alleged valuables on them. Roberto himself later asserted that he could not be sure that both boys were indeed the thieves. Still, the boys were taken to the precinct where they were held without letting their parents come into the interrogation room. A few hours into holding, the police announced that Khalif had confessed to the crime. He was charged, fingerprinted, and his bail was set at $3,000. Khalif was living with a foster family at the time, and they did not have the money to make his bond or to pay the bail bondsman. When a neighbor offered to put up the bond, he was told that Khalif's probation officer, from another crime Khalif claimed he had not committed, had put a hold on his bond. He was taken to Rikers Island to await trial and resolution of the probation matter. This still was not the worst of it all. At Rikers Island, Khalif claimed that he was routinely harassed, especially by other guards. In one instance, he had a physical altercation with another inmate, after which he was placed in solitary confinement for over 2 years. All of which was happening before his trial had even begun. Khalif's attorney, Brendan O'Meara, claimed that his trial was prolonged because of a backlog in the judicial system. Brendan also claimed that every time Khalif would appear in front of a judge, the same thing would happen. The judge would tell him to admit guilt, serve 2 years plus time served, and Khalif would deny the charges every single time. This went on until 2013 when Roberto returned to Mexico and could not make it to trial. Khalif was released that same day. But Khalif continued to fight for justice. He claimed that the system had worked against him and discriminated against him. He also claimed that the guards at Rikers Island had repeatedly harmed him and other inmates. While Khalif was released with a GED education, he did not attend college. It later emerged that Khalif was suffering from depression because of his time in solitary confinement. Moreover, Khalif had tried ending his life several times. The first time, he claimed, he was goaded by the guards at Rikers. In 2015, his mother found him hanging outside his bedroom window by the air conditioning unit. Khalif was 22 at the time of his passing. His case sparked a larger conversation on illegal imprisonments, forced confessions, and the negative impacts of solitary confinement. It became a turning point in the United States judicial system, with many errors in Khalif's case being presented as evidence for reform. While several charities and initiatives were started in his honor, it is a shame Khalif did not live long enough to see them come through. Derek Bentley. Derek Bentley's case remains one of the most controversial executions in British history. In 1952, 19-year-old Derek and his 16-year-old friend Christopher Craig attempted to break into a confectionery warehouse in Croydon, England. Craig was carrying a revolver, while Bentley had only a knife and a knuckle duster. When neighbors spotted the pair climbing onto the roof of the building, police were called to the scene. As officers arrived and climbed up to confront them, events quickly spiraled out of control. During the confrontation, a police officer named Frederick Fairfax tried to arrest Bentley. At that moment, Craig still had the weapon. According to police testimony, Bentley shouted the words, "Let him have it, Chris." Craig then opened fire, wounding Fairfax before another officer, Police Constable Sidney Miles, climbed onto the roof. Craig fired again, unaliving Miles with a shot to the head. Both boys were arrested and charged with unaliving. However, the case soon took a controversial turn. Craig had fired the gun and admitted to shooting the officer, but because he was only 16, British law at the time prevented him from receiving the ultimate penalty. Bentley's lawyers appealed the verdict, pointing to the unclear evidence, his mental condition, and the fact that he had not fired the gun. The appeal failed. On January 28, 1953, Derek Bentley was hanged at Wandsworth Prison. He was only 19 years old. The execution sparked outrage across Britain. More than 200 members of Parliament signed petitions asking for clemency, and protests took place outside the prison. Many believed Bentley had been unfairly punished for a crime he did not physically commit. Decades later, those concerns were finally acknowledged. In 1993, Bentley received a posthumous royal pardon, and in 1998, the Court of Appeal officially overturned his conviction, declaring that he had been denied a fair trial. Today, Derek's case is widely remembered as a tragic miscarriage of justice and one of the key cases that helped push the United Kingdom toward abolishing the death penalty. Cyntoia Brown. Cyntoia Brown's case highlights many flaws in the judicial system and in society as a whole. Born to an alcoholic mother and an unknown father, Cyntoia was placed for adoption. While she claimed that her adopted family was kind and loving, she was disruptive and rebellious. Eventually, she was placed under state care, but managed to run away from state care several times. Eventually, she made her way from Kentucky to Nashville, where she met Jamarion McLaughlin. Over the course of the next year, Jamarion would harm the 16-year-old repeatedly and force her into work she did not want to partake in. In 2004, Cyntoia was approached by 43-year-old Johnny Allen Michael. While he worked as a real estate agent, Sunday school preacher, and youth pastor, and had even set up a ministry for the homeless, Cyntoia claimed that he approached her and propositioned her. While Johnny's family claimed that this could not have been the case at all, and that Johnny was likely only helping her, both the prosecution and defense argued otherwise. The only question was whether she had intended on unaliving him premeditatedly or whether she was actually in fear for her life. According to the prosecution, Cyntoia shot Johnny in the head with his firearm as he slept. She then stole his truck and close to $200 from his wallet and left the scene. She later abandoned the vehicle in a Walmart parking lot before returning the next day. According to the prosecution's witness, Cyntoia planned on robbing Johnny's residence yet again. This was what the prosecution based their entire case on. However, the defense claimed that she was just a 16-year-old who had been trafficked, and this was the only way she knew how to survive. Still, the judge claimed that Cyntoia's behavior showed her lack of remorse for the crime and that she was not in any imminent danger when she shot and unalived Johnny. She was tried as an adult and sentenced to serving a life term with the possibility of parole when she was 67 years old. While in prison, Cyntoia turned her life around, earned her GED, and enrolled in college, where she had a perfect GPA. She also continued to fight her case. In 2013, Cyntoia's case gained renewed interest when several celebrities petitioned for her release. They argued that she never denied shooting Johnny, but that the judge overlooked the circumstances of the case. She was only 16, came from a broken background, and was trafficked. They also asserted that Johnny had a dark side, and that the prosecution repeatedly dismissed the defense's attorneys who testified against Johnny as irrelevant. In 2013, Tennessee Governor Bill Haslam commuted her original sentence, setting her release date for 2019. After being released, Cyntoia continued to advocate for other young girls and women who were trafficked and faced harm. George Stinney Jr. In 2004, 60 years after he had been executed for allegedly unaliving two girls, an 11-year-old and an 8-year-old, there was renewed interest in George Stinney's case. In 1994, 14-year-old George Stinney was tried for the unaliving of two white girls in Pinewood, South Carolina. According to witnesses, George was seen guiding the two girls as they approached him to ask for the site to find maypops. The girls' bodies were found in a ditch, with the coroner claiming that they had been beaten with an object several times, contributing to their passing. George's father even assisted in finding the girls' bodies, but just a few hours later, the sheriff announced that George Stinney Jr. was charged with the crime. Several acts of injustice were carried out. The sheriff did not have probable cause to arrest George. He was a 14-year-old who was questioned without his parents present at the interrogation. An alleged confession was signed without counsel present, and George was declared a criminal without due process being carried out. The trial officially began after an 81-day confinement during which George's family was not allowed to visit him. His father was fired from his job at the sawmill, and the family had to relocate from Pinewood because of repeated threats. In April 1994, George's case officially began. Again, several things went wrong here. There was an all-white jury trying the case, and George's state-appointed attorney did not contest anything the prosecution claimed. At one point, the prosecution contradicted itself when it presented two different versions of what they claimed George had told the sheriff. In one case, they claimed that George had unalived the young girls in self-defense after they attacked him first, and in the other case, they claimed that George had stalked the girls and attacked them. The state-appointed attorney also did not question the fact that there was no signed confession, just the sheriff's word against a 14-year-old. George's side also did not present any witnesses or anyone to testify in his favor. The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours and returned with a guilty verdict that same day. George Stinney Jr. was executed via electrocution on June 16th that year. He became the youngest convict in the United States history, executed at the age of 14. For the next 60 years, there was interest in George's case, but it was not until 2004 that George was finally exonerated. Besides the court's handling of the case, attorneys acting on the Stinney family's behalf claimed that there had been other suspects at the time of George's arrest, including a wealthy white man, George Burke. The attorneys claimed that there was more evidence than not to suggest that the girls were unalived at another location and their bodies had been dumped in the area. Ironically, while everyone else celebrated George's exoneration, the families of the 2 young victims did not. They claimed that George's portrayal as a pitiful young boy was far from the truth. They claimed that he confessed to unaliving the girls at least thrice during his incarceration. Again, the boys' attorneys claimed that the confessions were George's last, desperate attempt at clemency, which was denied repeatedly by South Carolina's governor. In any case, George Stinney Jr. was denied due process, a fact that remains undisputed, even by those who do not agree with his exoneration. Lionel Tate. In January 2021, Lionel Tate became the youngest American to receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole. At just 13 years old, Lionel was sentenced for the 1999 unaliving of his cousin, 6-year-old Tiffany Eunick. The case was controversial for several reasons, but we have to go back to where it all began. On July 28, 1999, Lionel's mother, Kathleen, was supposed to babysit her 6-year-old niece, Tiffany. Kathleen left the 2 kids downstairs in their Broward County home while she went to do some chores upstairs. The last thing she remembered happening downstairs was the kids watching wrestling on television. Approximately 45 minutes later, Lionel rushed upstairs to tell his mother that Tiffany was not breathing. Kathleen told the court that her niece had bruising all over her body. She was pronounced unalived at the scene, and the autopsy report revealed that she suffered other injuries included a fractured skull, lacerated liver, fractured rib, and swollen brain. This became a criminal matter after doctors claimed that Tiffany's injuries were intense, and it was likely that the beating lasted for several minutes. While Lionel told officers that he was playing wrestling with his cousin and did not anticipate anything bad happening, the state attorney disagreed. Kenneth Padowitz, the prosecutor, argued that Lionel knew exactly what he was doing, and there had to come a point where he would have realized he was injuring Tiffany to a near-fatal extent. The defense attorney, however, claimed that Lionel was only 12 at the time of the attack and had in no way premeditated unaliving his cousin. A controversial issue in Lionel's case became the Florida statute that argued that the jury had to convict Lionel of first-degree unaliving even if they believed he did not intend on unaliving Tiffany. All the prosecution needed to show was that Lionel's actions contributed to Tiffany's passing. In 2001, Judge Joel Lazarus returned with a guilty verdict, sentencing Lionel to life behind bars without parole. The case was controversial for several reasons. Lionel was only 13. The Florida statute did not require showing criminal intent, and the prosecution later openly joined the defense in appealing Lionel's case. Judge Lazarus criticized the prosecution, stating that if they disagreed with the verdict, they should never have moved forward with a first-degree conviction. But, in any case, their efforts were successful, and Lionel's original sentence was overturned in 2004. They managed to figure out a loophole, showing that Lionel was denied due process when his mental competency was not checked ahead of the trial. This meant that his punishment was a year's house arrest and 10 years probation. While this should have been considered a win for everyone, especially Lionel, the case unfortunately became a tragic tale. In 2005, after only a year out of prison and while still 18, Lionel found himself back in front of a judge. This time, he stood accused of using a weapon to intimidate a pizza delivery man and then burglarizing a friend of his. The delivery man phoned the police and later returned with officers to identify Lionel. In 2006, Lionel admitted to violating his parole by acquiring a weapon, but refused to tell officers where he had disposed of it. This meant a heavier penalty, with some believing the Florida circuit judges wanted to make an example out of Lionel. He was sentenced to 30 years for violating his parole, which is being served concurrently with a 10-year sentence for robbery. As of 2007, Lionel Tate is still in prison. Abdullah al-Hueti. Abdullah al-Hueti's case became one of the most controversial juvenile justice cases in Saudi Arabia, raising international concerns about the treatment of minors within the country's legal system. In 2017, when Abdullah was just 14 years old, a robbery and an unaliving took place at a jewelry store in the Tabuk region of northwestern Saudi Arabia. According to investigators, a group of masked attackers stormed the store, unaliving a security guard and stealing valuable jewelry. Authorities quickly launched an investigation and arrested several suspects, including Abdullah al-Hueti. During the early stages of the investigation, Abdullah reportedly confessed to being involved in the crime. Prosecutors relied heavily on that confession to build their case. However, Abdullah later told the court that the confession had been forced and that he had been beaten and pressured by investigators while in custody. His lawyers argued that he had signed documents without fully understanding them and that he had been interrogated without proper legal representation. They also claimed there was evidence placing Abdullah somewhere else at the time of the robbery, suggesting that he could not have participated in the attack. Despite these claims, a criminal court convicted Abdullah of unaliving and robbery. Under Saudi law at the time, juveniles could still face the maximum penalty in certain serious cases, including unaliving. The court sentenced Abdullah al-Hueti to capital punishment, sparking immediate criticism from human rights organizations around the world. Groups such as Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch argued that the sentence violated international standards for juvenile justice. They pointed out that international law, including the Convention on the Rights of the Child, prohibits the execution of individuals for crimes committed when they were under 18 years old. Advocates also raised concerns about the reliability of Abdullah's confession and the allegations that it had been obtained through coercion. According to activists following the case, the prosecution had not presented strong physical evidence linking Abdullah directly to the crime scene. In 2020, Saudi Arabia announced legal reforms that were intended to reduce the use of the capital penalty for minors. These reforms stated that individuals who committed crimes while under the age of 18 would no longer face execution in most cases and would instead receive prison sentences capped at a maximum number of years. However, activists pointed out that the reforms did not automatically apply to every case, leaving uncertainty about Abdullah's fate. After several appeals and years of legal battles, a Saudi appeals court eventually overturned Abdullah al-Hueti's sentence. The court ordered a retrial, acknowledging concerns about the evidence and the circumstances surrounding his confession. The decision offered a glimmer of hope for his supporters, who had spent years campaigning for a fair review of the case. Jordan Brown. In 2009, at the age of 11, Jordan Brown found himself standing in front of a judge, claiming that he did not unalive his stepmother. On the morning of February 20th, a 4-year-old was found sitting outside, crying. Tree cutters from nearby were alerted, and the young child told them that her mother was not responding. They went inside to find 26-year-old, pregnant Kenzie Hauk shot in the side of her head. She was rushed to the hospital, where doctors declared her and her unborn child deceased. Kenzie's fiancé, Eric, was at work, and their 2 kids, Eric's 11-year-old son, Jordan Brown, and Kenzie's 7-year-old daughter, were on their way to school. The police arrived at the scene and believed that Kenzie was shot in close range by a shotgun while she slept. They interviewed the children and immediately believed Jordan had something to do with it. Police officers believed that the unaliving weapon was the shotgun Jordan used on weekends to hunt with his father, a Christmas present. They also found a shell casing on Jordan's usual route to work. Jordan was interviewed twice on the day of Kenzie's unaliving, and by 3 o'clock that morning, police formally charged Jordan with the crime against his stepmother. According to the prosecution, Jordan detested his stepmother, his stepsisters, and his father's unborn child, believing that he would soon be replaced by the new baby. Prosecutors argued that Jordan had premeditated the crime and used his hunting shotgun to commit the act, but the defense claimed something else entirely. They claimed that the prosecution was heavily invested in circumstantial evidence and was not looking at a much more probable suspect, Kenzie's ex-boyfriend, Adam Harvey. Adam had been told a few days prior that he was not the father of Kenzie's 4-year-old, and he had a drunken encounter with some of Kenzie's family members just 8 hours prior to when Kenzie was found unalived. Adam, however, claimed that he had spent the night at his parents' basement and then later went to meet a friend, establishing an alibi. Jordan's defense also claimed that Adam had only just moved some 10 miles from Kenzie's new home, asserting that he was there to spy on his ex. But what made the case even more sensational was the fact that the prosecution argued for Jordan to be tried as an adult. Under Pennsylvania law, an adult committing a first-degree unaliving would be sentenced to a life term without parole. In a juvenile case, however, he would be sentenced till he turned 21. Amnesty International stepped in to advocate for Jordan's case to be heard in juvenile court, but even there, the judge found that he had in fact unalived his stepmother. It was not until June of 2016 that Jordan was released from prison, placed under house arrest. However, Jordan, his father, and their attorneys continued to fight his case, claiming that he was wrongfully accused. In 2013, Jordan managed to fight his way to a retrial where a board of judges sat together to discuss the case. They came to a 5-0 decision in favor of having Jordan's record expunged. They claimed that there was just as much evidence to suggest that he was not the unaliver as there was to claim that he was. But Jordan's journey was not over just yet. He claimed that, as a result of his incarceration, he now suffers from post-traumatic stress disorder. Jordan also claimed that he and his family had to move away from New Beaver because Kenzie's family still believed he was the unaliver. In 2024, Jordan unsuccessfully tried to sue the state troopers who arrested him, alleging that they violated his 5th and 6th Amendment rights. That case was ultimately dismissed. The Free Grace case. The media only knows her as Grace, a 15-year-old black girl from Beverly Hills, Michigan, whose case gained national attention when she was sent to juvenile detention for missing her online homework. Grace had 2 run-ins with the law in 2018. One for a domestic dispute with her mother, and another for theft after she had stolen a cell phone out of someone's locker. For those 2 cases, she was placed on probation. In 2020, when the world shut down for COVID and classes moved online, Grace found it particularly hard to adjust. She had already been diagnosed with ADHD and had a hard time coping with online classes. In June 2020, Grace's probation officer advocated for residential treatment, alleging that she had anger management issues. The judge rejected the idea and instead placed her under intensive probation. But then, a few weeks later, her probation officer petitioned the court again, this time arguing for juvenile detention. Why? Because the 15-year-old had slept during a call made by the probation officer, and when the school was contacted, Grace's teacher claimed she had missed an assignment. However, the teacher also claimed that this was not unusual behavior in Grace's class. Judge Brennan presided over the case and stated that Grace had violated the terms of her probation when she missed her schoolwork. She sentenced Grace to be incarcerated at the Children's Village Juvenile Detention Center. The judge called Grace a threat to the community and stated that she had not fulfilled the expectation with regard to school performance. Grace and her mother requested that she be returned home at an early June court status hearing. Instead, Judge Brennan reaffirmed that Grace should continue to be incarcerated to get needed mental health services. Critics quickly argued that the punishment was excessive and ignored the widespread academic disruption students were experiencing during remote learning. Disability advocates and juvenile justice reform groups said the ruling reflected deeper systemic problems, including the over-criminalization of black youth and racial disparities within the juvenile justice system. The case gained national attention after a ProPublica article about her situation went viral in July 2020 under the hashtag #FreeGrace, sparking a Change.org petition that gathered more than 200,000 to 150,000 signatures and drawing support from members of Congress, the ACLU of Michigan, and local officials who argued students should not be punished for missing homework during the pandemic. Protests followed, including a car, caravan, and demonstrations outside her school and the Oakland County Courthouse, where activists and Black Lives Matter supporters demanded her release. Despite these calls, Judge Mary Ellen Brennan initially refused to release Grace during a July 20th hearing, saying doing so would be a mistake. However, after 78 days in detention, the Michigan Court of Appeals ordered her release on July 31st, allowing her to return home while still remaining on probation. Grace and her mother later thanked supporters who had pushed for her freedom. Paul Gingerich. In April 2010, 12-year-old Paul Gingerich and his friends, 15-year-old Colt Lundy and 15-year-old Chase Williams, planned to unalive Colt's stepfather, Philip Danner, in their home in Indiana. According to investigators, the three boys had discussed the idea beforehand and agreed that the only way Colt could escape what they described as strict discipline at home was to eliminate his stepfather. On the night of the attack, Colt stole one of his stepfather's handguns. When Philip entered the garage, Colt fired the shotgun, unaliving him. The boys fled the scene afterward, but were caught in the stolen vehicle not too long away from the crime scene. What made the case particularly controversial was Paul's age. At just 12 years old, he was barely a teenager, yet prosecutors charged him with unaliving and conspiracy. Instead of keeping the case in juvenile court, a judge ruled that Paul would be tried as an adult. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Paul had been an active participant in planning the unaliving. They claimed the group had discussed the crime beforehand, and that Paul had helped set the plan in motion. Paul's lawyers argued that he was easily influenced by the older boys and did not fully understand the consequences of what was being planned. Eventually, Paul accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit unaliving and was sentenced to 25 years. Critics immediately questioned whether a child as young as 12 should ever be placed in an adult prison. Juvenile justice advocates argued that the decision ignored decades of research showing that children's brains are still developing. During the trial, prosecutors argued that Paul had been an active participant in planning the unaliving. They claimed the group had discussed the crime beforehand and that Paul had helped set the plan in motion. Paul's lawyers argued that he was easily influenced by the older boys and did not fully understand the consequences of what was being planned. Eventually, Paul accepted a plea deal and pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit unaliving and was sentenced to 25 years. Critics immediately questioned whether a child as young as 12 should ever be placed in an adult prison. Juvenile justice advocates argued that the decision ignored decades of research showing that children's brains are still developing and that young offenders are far more capable of rehabilitation than adults. Paul's case continued to attract attention from legal experts and advocacy groups. Several organizations argued that his sentence was excessive and that he should have been tried in juvenile court instead. Appeals eventually reached the Indiana Supreme Court, which reviewed the circumstances of his sentencing. The court ultimately ruled that the original punishment was inappropriate for someone his age and ordered that he be resentenced. In 2013, after serving several years in prison, Paul was resentenced and transferred to a juvenile facility. In 2016, after spending nearly 6 years in custody, Paul was finally released. Jamarion Law Horn. In 2014, on a quiet and peaceful day, 12-year-old Jamarion Law Horn made his way to the playground where 9-year-old Connor Verkerker was playing with his brother. The two boys grew up in the same Kentwood area, knew one another, and had even played together. This day, however, Jamarion did not approach Connor to play. In an act no one could have seen coming, Jamarion lunged at Connor, stabbing him repeatedly with a kitchen knife. He then calmly left the scene and made his way to a neighbor's house. Connor's brother rushed home to tell their parents what had just happened, and by the time Connor could be taken to the hospital, he was already unalived. Meanwhile, Jamarion went up to his neighbor's house and calmly asked to call the police. He got on the phone with 911 himself, alerting them that he had just unalived the 9-year-old. According to the neighbor, Jamarion sat patiently on the couch, not making a sound. He only spoke when he saw officers approaching the playground from the window, and only to inform them where he was so they could arrest him. The officers arrested him, and that was when they realized that Jamarion wanted this to happen. He had called 911, telling them his crime, and asked for the maximum possible punishment. The Grand Rapids community was in shock, not only because someone had been unalived, but the unaliver was also a child. Still, the prosecution claimed that Jamarion's case should not be treated lightly, and that he had fully planned the unaliving. They pointed toward several key details. This was not the first time Jamarion had tried to unalive someone. Just days earlier, and per Jamarion's own confession, he had buried a kitchen knife in the playground and tried to lure Connor and his brother to the site. He then also admitted that he picked Connor and that the attack was not completely random. The prosecution even pointed out that Jamarion was known to have anger issues and was disruptive at home. The defense, on the other hand, claimed that Jamarion was a misunderstood preteen who came from a family that would regularly resort to punishment. Jamarion lived with his mother, Anita, and her boyfriend, Bernald. According to witness testimonies, Anita and Bernald were heavily addicted to substances. They also allegedly harmed Jamarion on more than one occasion. Bernal took the stand to testify that he did, in fact, hit Jamarion, and that he would receive the worst beating out of all of his siblings because he was the most defiant one. Still, the prosecution claimed that this was not a reason enough to unalive a random 9-year-old boy. They pushed for Jamarion to be tried as an adult and wanted the maximum possible punishment for the defendant. The case was controversial for several reasons. Jamarion was only 12, he came from a troubled background, and many members of Connor's family came together to plead for leniency. According to Connor's grandmother, there was no point in sending Jamarion away for the rest of his life. But that was what a court had originally decided for the 12-year-old. Under state law, however, Jamarion would only be sent to serve a life term if he did not meet his rehabilitation milestones while in juvenile detention. He would be incarcerated until the age of 21, required to have mandatory 6-month check-ins with the judge and show his reports. He was also expected to be a model citizen if he wanted to one day restart his life. In 2022, Jamarion had met all of his milestones. He had earned his GED and was on his way to earning a college degree. He was a model prisoner and had even started a support group. Most importantly, Jamarion never made an excuse for what he did. The judge reviewed all the information from the case and agreed that Jamarion had been sufficiently rehabilitated. In 2022, at 19 years old, Jamarion was released from prison.